Hi everyone. I'm glad to introduce today's seminar presenter, Dr. Francis O'Donnell. I actually host this seminar because we actually from the same department. And when you graduate?
2013.
2013. I'm graduated 2014 or 13. So we are just 2 years or 1 year behind. And she actually worked on the eco hydrology. So one poster, I just introduced her poster as you. She actually tried to develop the stochastic modeling how the tree actually grow up. So like he actually digging under the ground, and then she tried to have some side, and then he have a huge tree, right? And then he tried to build a stochastic modeling. That was I just kind of surprised, who actually thought. And then after that, we actually have personal communication in the department, and she did a really great job of the eco hydrology. So that's why I host today's seminar. And then I think that this seminar actually we can think about collaboration with the urban, with the biology, geography, or geological science, even environmental science, environmental engineering. So hope you guys enjoy.
Great, thanks John, and thanks a lot for inviting me. I'm currently in my second year on faculty at Auburn, certainly open to building new connections and new collaborations. What I'm going to talk about today is actually the postdoc work that I did at Northern Arizona University. Since that's kind of wrapping up and we actually are starting to have some conclusions coming out of it, but I hope it just gives you an idea of some of the type of work that I do. So take us away from Alabama a little bit to Arizona, where I did this work in Northern Arizona. And the forests there are ponderosa pine, and they've changed a lot in the last century. So when European settlers first showed up in the area, the forest looked like what you see on this side, where there were large, sparse ponderosa pine trees growing with a grass understory underneath them. So basal area refers to how much sort of area of wood there is relative to area of ground. So infrequent trees, and this condition was maintained by frequent low-intensity fires that burned through just the understory of this forest. So fires that weren't intense enough to kill the trees, but just killed any tree seedlings that were growing up underneath them to keep this condition maintained. Once people got there, or white people got there, more accurately, they started putting out those fires. They thought fire was bad for forests. So that combined with some unsustainable grazing and logging practices gave us what we have today, which is much more dense forests. So about the same amount of wood, which is what basal area gives you, but just as a lot of small trees. And fire is suppressed in these forests because if you introduce any amount of fire into the system with lots of small trees, you get a high intensity wildfire. And so you get fires that look like this, that are burning through the canopies of the trees, killing most of the canopy, result in soil damage, increases erosion, threatens lives and property. So all sorts of problems associated with this. And this is sort of the annual area burned in those high intensity wildfires, so just increasing a lot over the past century as this fire suppression problem has gotten worse. Another thing that's threatening these forests is that due to climate change, this is a mountainous area, and you have distinct changes in ecosystem type as you move up the mountain. And whenever you have trees getting killed by wildfire or drought mortality, a lot of times the next lowest ecosystem comes up and replaces it. So this is showing all the yellow is pinyon juniper woodland, which is downslope from the ponderosa pine. The green is the pine. And then the red area is area that's changed from ponderosa pine to pinyon juniper during the drought. And of course the problem with this is that eventually somebody's going to get pushed off the top of the mountain. So this is one way that we can lose biodiversity in these regions and have impacts of climate change that we're never going to recover from because we've lost some of our forests completely. So the remedy to these problems is forest restoration, which seeks to go in and thin out these forests, reduce the fuels, solve a lot of the problems, and that's actually starting to be done at a relatively large scale. So there's a proposed forest restoration initiative in Arizona that will happen over 1 million hectares of national forest land. And this is the West. Water is scarce here. So whenever you're thinking about doing something to a large amount of land, one of the first questions is, what is this going to do to our water? And so that's a big question because a lot of this is in one of the major watersheds for the Phoenix metropolitan area. And so what this forest restoration treatment does is they institute thinning to take out a lot of the smaller trees and then do prescribed or managed fire to try to reintroduce that regime of frequent low-intensity fires. And of course, the biggest thing they're going for here is reduced fire risk, so that we're not having to spend a ton of money fighting wildfires every summer out west. But some of the other goals are reducing plant water stress. So this is not a natural condition for ponderosa pine. They want to be in this more sparse condition where there aren't as many trees using the limited water resources, and all the trees are generally happier. It's also thought that this could decrease the rate of forest type conversion. So that issue of ecosystem types marching up the mountain, a lot of times that's brought on by a wildfire. A wildfire burns through and then the ecosystem changes. So by reducing the risk of wildfire, we'll change that. And then also this sort of loosely used term of improved hydrologic function, where these are watersheds that are going to produce more plentiful, cleaner water, both by preventing these large wildfires that have an associated erosion risk, but potentially by reducing evapotranspiration and allowing more water to flow downstream. And it's that last one that's probably the least well studied and defined. So just kind of a brief overview of what the hydrologic cycle looks like in these forests. It's dominated by evapotranspiration. About 85% of the precipitation that comes in is lost back to the atmosphere through ET. But it's these components of groundwater recharge and runoff that we're really interested in as the components that are sort of water that's available for people to use. And it's actually a very small portion of the overall precipitation the forests are receiving. There's a strong seasonal cycle. About 60% of the precipitation comes as snow in the winter, about 40% as monsoon thunderstorms in the summer. And it's the winter snowpack that generates most of the runoff and groundwater recharge. Those summer rains, in the summer in Arizona, even up in the mountains, there's a lot of radiation, high vapor pressure deficits, really good environment to just pump it all back into the atmosphere as soon as it falls, basically. So this is kind of our conceptual model of how we think forest restoration will affect the water cycle. So comparing an untreated forest to a restored forest. First and foremost, we'd expect an overall reduction in total overstory transpiration. Fewer trees using water, we expect to mean overall less water getting used. We expect increased throughfall of precipitation and that supporting both for rainfall and for snow, so greater ground snowpack. However, there's sort of a balancing act there, where yes, we open up the canopy to allow more precipitation to make it to the ground, but we also open up that understory to more radiation, more wind, more potential for understory evapotranspiration and snowpack sublimation. So there's kind of a balancing act here. And then overall, the thought is that this will lead to increased runoff and groundwater recharge. Mainly because we have some different mechanisms balancing each other out here, but we expect that it'll overall be positive in that direction. So just an overview of what I'm going to talk about. I did 2 pieces of modeling work related to these issues that I'm going to talk about first, and then some field work to try to get at what actually are the mechanisms driving this. So some of that mechanistic understanding we're trying to get at, there's just not data out there yet to deal with it. And that last piece we're still kind of wrapping up the data analysis for, so I'm always interested to hear people's thoughts if you have a good way to deal with the kind of data sets we're dealing with. Okay, so to start out with, I'm just going to briefly talk about, this is a paper we published in 2014 with sort of the first initial cut at looking at what is the effect of forest restoration at a watershed scale on stream flow and downstream water resources that I worked on with a group from the Nature Conservancy of Arizona. So this focused on the Salt Verde River watershed. So this is one of the major water sources to the city of Phoenix. Flows into Roosevelt Dam, just above the city. The Phoenix metropolitan area would not exist if it were not for the Salt River, and the Salt River being dammed. So most of, you'll see all of the green area in the watershed is ponderosa pine forest. The red areas are ponderosa pine forests that currently have a plan for restoration thinnings under the Fry project. And this is all upstream. So as you can see, the ponderosa pine forests, they don't make up all that much of the watershed area, but it's estimated that they contribute about 50% of the runoff that's producing flow in the Salt River, because a lot of the rest of this area is desert. And so it's just not getting much precipitation overall. And so it's these forests, snowpack and mountain forests that a lot of times is referred to the water towers for desert cities that are sending a lot of water downstream. So one thing we went back and forth about a lot, sort of at the inception of this project, is do we want to do this through a process-based hydrologic model, or do we want to use a statistical model? And we ended up deciding to go with a statistical model for two reasons. One, there was not a lot of good data out there to get at some of the mechanistic things happening with forest restoration and the hydrologic cycle. We didn't have good measurements of things like evapotranspiration, soil moisture, all these sort of internal parts of the water budget. But what we did have was a rich history in Arizona of paired watershed studies testing the impacts of forest thinning on the rainfall runoff relationship in the forest. So this is an example of the Beaver Creek watersheds that are just south of Flagstaff. So they had 14 small ponderosa pine watersheds. For all of them, they have about 25 years of precipitation, monthly precipitation and stream flow data. And in about half of them, they conducted logging treatments that reduced basal area by about 30 to 100%. The range of reductions for forest restoration treatments is about 30 to 50%. So this was including the range of treatments we were looking at. And so we decided to develop a multiple regression model for the effect of thinning on stream flow based on precipitation, the intensity of the thinning treatment, and the time since the thinning treatment was done, which we tested a lot of different variables, and those were the three that had a significant effect on the increase in precipitation following thinning. Just to make sure that this wasn't too much of a localized relationship, we also used data from a second historic paired watershed experiment in eastern Arizona, which sort of spans the two main geologic types that we have in Arizona, but the same vegetation type. And these were just kind of fun sites to go out and survey and look at. We found a lot of cool old hydrologic measurement equipment, and still a lot of the old flumes and weirs are still out there. So it was a fun field trip a few times. So then in order to look at potential climate scenarios, so this is, these treatments are going to be happening, we expect for the first phase of Fry over the next 10 to 15 years, and then if all goes well with the federal government having money to do this, probably all the forests in the watershed would undergo restoration treatment within about 50 years. So we are looking at a span of time where we could be dealing with climate change effects. But one thing about the Southwest is that we have an incredible amount of year-to-year variability in climate, as well as decadal scale variability due to fluctuations in ENSO and the Pacific Decadal Oscillation that kind of swamp out most of the signal of climate change in terms of precipitation data. So what we did in order to come up with our climate scenarios was go over the full period of record, pick the driest 10 years and the wettest 10 years. And we ran all our models for these two scenarios to sort of give us an envelope of possibility for like the worst case scenario and the best case scenario in terms of precipitation. So these were our results. So this is the runoff increase in the Salt River in million cubic meters per year for the drought scenario and the pluvial scenario over 15 years of the already planned fry thinning. So these were the red areas in the first figure I showed. So what is already sort of slated to be done on the ground. And so for one thing, we predicted you really only get the runoff increase above a certain threshold level of precipitation. So in the drought scenario, we do get, in both scenarios, we get about a 20% increase over baseline, but keep in mind that for the drought scenario, baseline is a lot lower overall. And it's really those few wet years that are driving any observed increase. We get a decline on both ends because our analysis of the data from the historic watersheds indicated that this thinning increase is transient. The forests do recover, and eventually you see no more increase in runoff after about 10 years. So that declines. So overall, it seems like relatively large numbers. And so we can think about this in terms of the cumulative runoff increase over 30 years. And so this is, with this next set of scenarios, what we did is we said, okay, let's say that we actually do, over the next 30 years, thin half to all of the forests, ponderosa pine forests in the Salt Verde watershed. So this is, we get about half of them thin, we get all of them thin. And so the cumulative runoff increase over 30 years. And it seems like pretty large numbers. But now if we look at this on the annual scale, so now, of course, numbers are getting smaller. And finally, let's look at this as a percent of total flow in the Salt River. And now we're only looking at less than a 2% increase in flow of the Salt River. So sort of our overall lesson here was that, yes, forest restoration will have a positive impact on stream flow in the Salt River, we expect, but it's an extremely small increase. And a lot of that is coming from the fact that of this transient effect of the thinning, and that it's going to take at least 30 years to get all these forests thinned. So if they're producing extra runoff for 10 years, you would really almost have to thin all of them instantly to really see a gain. And there's this sort of long-tailed effect. A group at Arizona State ended up using a process-based model to look at the same thing. They found an estimate of 0 to 4% increase in Salt River flow. So we have converging lines of evidence that this is the case. So one thing that came out of the research that we did is that if you're looking at an entire river basin, because of this sort of scale issue, you're not seeing big increases. But if you're trying to manage an upstream water source, especially for some areas where we're trying to maintain aquatic habitat, this actually could make a fairly large difference doing forest restoration. So that was one of our takeaways, is that we need to focus more on the upstream things that are important. Another takeaway is that in the approach we used, we were not able to account for that potential effect of vegetation creeping up slope. And so one of the criticisms of forest restoration is it worth it to restore all these ponderosa pine forests if they're going to get replaced by pinyon juniper, the next thing down the slope, within 50 years? So that's what we wanted to get at with this next project. And we did this at the Grand Canyon. So amazingly beautiful site, one of the most amazing places in the world. And we did a modeling study there. So we didn't actually get to spend much time at the Grand Canyon. But we were looking at their water sources. So all of the water coming into the Grand Canyon that's either used to flush the toilets at the visitor center, or as a lot of the tributary streams that are within the park that are both kind of important for backcountry use of those areas, as well as spawning habitat for a lot of the keystone species in the Colorado River system. That is all coming off of the Kaibab Plateau, which it's this region up here above the park. And that's a mountainous forested plateau region. It's a karst geology underneath it, so a lot of the flow coming off of that is into sinkholes that then sink into the plateau and discharge in streams in the canyon. So they almost think about protecting flow into the sinkholes as really being key to protecting their water supply. And so this was kind of a stakeholder involved project with Grand Canyon National Park to help them do some vulnerability assessment and test some management scenarios to see what the best way to protect their water supply was. So our major research questions were, first, from the vegetation side, could forest restoration slow the rate of forest type conversions due to these interacting effects of climate change and wildfire, which often acts as the catalyst for vegetation change. So just, is restoration effective in doing that? We also want to know if restoration can help sustain water resources under a changing climate. One of the negative potential effects of vegetation type changes is that if you replace ponderosa pine with juniper, it doesn't accumulate snow as well. It has a higher potential transpiration rate, so you actually get less runoff from a pinyon juniper forest under the same precipitation as from a ponderosa forest. And then also, sort of the main question that the Park Service had for us was, we're considering either a 10-year rotation for restoration, so going back in 10 years later and rethinning, reburning, versus a 25-year rotation, which is obviously less costly, but they wanted to know would it be as effective. So our study site is the Kaibab Plateau, has a broad range of elevations which are expressed in our 4 different dominant forest types, just going up from low elevation to high elevation. And one of the reasons we chose this site is there's a rich data set of dendroecological data, so using tree rings to reconstruct the ecosystems that have existed there over the past. And for the vegetation component of this project, that was important. So this project was a collaborative effort between myself and a postdoc at NAU's School of Forestry. And what we were doing was we were coupling a spatial vegetation and fire model to the statistical hydrologic modeling I was using in the previous project to look at the effects of restoration and vegetation type on future outputs. And so we have our restoration scenarios. We used the RCP 4.5 and 8.5 climate change scenarios. So here, unlike the past project, we're actually starting to look at some potential climate change scenarios. Those go into the vegetation model, which predict the future spatial distribution of vegetation types on the Kaibab Plateau, as well as the future future fire regime. Those go into the hydrologic model, and main output is expected future runoff. We also did a little bit of work with some simple work with sediment yield, because that is one of the big risks associated with wildfire. So this is an overview of the vegetation model. I know this is a water group, so I hope you don't have too many questions about this because I didn't do it myself. But it's Climate FVS and Landis 2, which are our Forest Service products. Climate FVS relates climate characteristics to the growth, establishment, and mortality of different tree species. And then Landis 2 is a stochastic spatial fire model. So we were doing multiple runs of this to get sort of what is the average situation for fire in this. And that outputs a future landscape composition, both what are the vegetation types and what does the fire regime look like. So with the hydrologic modeling methods, we had our management scenarios, our future vegetation types. I used the climate scenarios to develop the projected future precipitation. And then, unlike the last project where we're just focused on ponderosa pine, I developed vegetation type specific regression equations to predict runoff in undisturbed forests. And then also looking at if they had been restored, looking at what the water yield change was due to that disturbance, up or down. So we have an undisturbed plus or minus a term for restoration.
So Francis,
Yes.
What is the scale of this model? That is grid by grid or watershed?
So the vegetation model is gridded. So that was working on a 1 hectare grid. And this is, So when I did the regression modeling equation, I normalized everything by watershed area. Watershed area was one of the things we tested as a potential explaining factor, but for these smaller watersheds, we didn't have that. So this is just based on entire water yield from the whole plateau. Okay, and this took advantage of the fact that Beaver Creek and Castle Creek, the historic paired watersheds I was working with before, those aren't the only ones that that were in use all across Arizona with a pretty good distribution across vegetation types. We had good data for rainfall runoff relationships for different vegetation types. We have our 4 major vegetation types that we find on the plateau. I also analyzed some data from Chaparral, which is the next thing down the mountain from what's on the Kaibab Plateau, since under some of the future scenarios that starts moving up and encroaching on the plateau. So this is the result of the forest type distribution model. So I know there's a lot going on here. These are the restoration scenarios. So each group of 3 bars is one climate scenario. So no climate change, medium climate change, high climate change. And then each bar is no restoration. Low restoration is the 25-year, so infrequent restoration and frequent restoration. And so in all these cases, the brown bars are pinyon juniper, and in all cases, that increases. And actually one of the things we found is that in some cases, if you restored forests that were close to the ponderosa pinyon juniper boundary, that could actually be a catalyst for changing it over to pinyon juniper. So that was sort of one of our management recommendations coming out of this, is that you have to be careful with those forests that restoration is not causing type conversions. But overall, so the black bars are important to focus on, under the black bars, the red, purple, and gray bars are important to focus on, because those are those high elevation forest types that we're in danger of losing due to climate change overall. So we want to keep those bars as large as possible. And restoration in all of the climate scenarios was effective in preserving that, those high elevation forest types. And overall in helping to maintain some of the area in ponderosa pine, which is the orange bars. So overall, the restoration was effective in preserving these high elevation forest types. So these are the results for change in runoff. The error bars indicate the range of variability over the different fire scenarios. So going from a bad fire to a sort of a bad stochastic fire scenario to a good stochastic fire scenario. And so 3 lines for high restoration, low restoration, and no restoration. And then this is just the no climate change and high climate change. And this is for, I'm calling this typical runoff because this is for the a year receiving the median amount of runoff. So average climate conditions. And without climate change, we actually see that the higher restoration, initially the restoration has a positive effect as we're getting that transient increase in runoff due to the restoration, but it all kind of converges on the no restoration scenario as that happens. But if we look at the scenario where we did have climate change worked in, that's where we're really starting to prevent some of those forest type conversions that have negative effects on runoff. And the high restoration particularly is, by the end of the century, is very effective on this. So if the goal is end of the century, it's definitely the 10-year restoration rotation is better. If we're looking sort of mid-century, they were both sort of effective in at least preventing large declines. This is runoff during a drought year, so this is a year that was in the 10th percentile for precipitation, so relatively dry year, 10-year drought essentially. And this is, here we see a decline in runoff sort of no matter what. So this is, a bad year is going to be a bad year under climate change regardless. And so sort of one of the messages is that we need those medium to high precipitation years to maintain water resources. And if we're looking at cases where we're having extended droughts and extended dry years, we could start to have some problems, because even with good forest management, we're going to have low runoff in those years. So the last piece of this is, I've been working with the data from the paired watershed studies to do undisturbed forest rainfall runoff relationships and predictions of the increase in runoff due to restoration, and that had all worked well. I've gotten really good results from the data. Several of these watersheds were actually burned in high-intensity wildfires, and then they tried to re-instrument them. So you can see here it's kind of working okay. Here, everything just got blown out by the high flows that happen after a wildfire. So the last piece of this that I wanted to do was to go in and try to do a similar prediction for fire and for what is the effect of fire on runoff. Because one of the last piece that our stakeholders were interested in is, okay, if we can't afford to do restoration anywhere, are there some places on the plateau where we should restore to try to prevent fire that are particularly vulnerable to reductions in hydrologic function due to it? And this did not work well at all. It was kind of all over the place. There's a lot of sensitivity to precipitation intensity immediately following the fire. The post-fire recovery period happens a lot more rapidly. So sort of when rainfall happens relative to when it burned, there's a lot more noise in the relationships. So doing something that was sort of simple and easy to couple to the vegetation model was a lot bigger challenge here. So what we did to help our stakeholders was, and you're sort of running up against the end of the project, was to do a simple sediment yield model. And this is based on, there was a site in New Mexico that did an airborne LiDAR survey of their undisturbed forest research site. And so they had high resolution elevation data. Right after it happened, they had a high severity wildfire. They got rapid funding to do a second LiDAR survey a year later. So they had elevation change at high resolution between pre-fire and post-fire. And they were able to develop a pretty good relationship between sediment yield related to slope and burn severity. Now there is some that is specific to that location and that event. So we don't want to look at sort of the overall amount of sediment yield, but we can use that to think about what points on the landscape would be more vulnerable. And so we used this relationship to essentially develop an expected value of sediment yield. Because we have these stochastic model runs doing fire, we can figure out the probability that any pixel on the grid burns at low, medium, or high severity in a given year. And then using this relationship and the slope of that cell, we can say, okay, well, what is the sediment yield if it burns at low, medium, or high severity? Sort of do a weighted average or expected value and get this expected sediment yield. Again, this is not sort of an actual amount we expect to happen, but just comparing points on the landscape in terms of what's most vulnerable. And so these are our no, low, and high restoration scenarios over the first 50 years of the model period. And we do see that the area around the rim of the canyon is fairly susceptible, mostly due to high slope and its pinyon juniper, which if it's going to burn, is going to burn at high intensity, usually. But by doing restoration, we're able to reduce the sensitivity of a lot of this area in the mid regions to these effects. And that makes sense because it's the forests in that sort of middle elevation region that are actually good targets for restoration. It's the high elevation and low elevation is generally not where we're doing the restoration. But even though those are the forests being restored, that reduces fire spread over the whole plateau and helps some of those high elevation points as well. So our main conclusions, the forest restoration was effective at preventing conversion or vegetation type conversions. For runoff, it helps in the median years, and especially the higher, especially under the severe climate change and the higher restoration scenario. But really, a lot of those changes were overall fairly small. And really the biggest benefit is going to be the reduction in erosion and threats to water quality due to wildfire. Okay, so this is kind of the last piece of this. of course, in Arizona, a lot of people are interested in water resources and what's coming off of the forest, but there's also sort of the more holistic view that the point of this restoration is to improve forest health, and to, in a water-limited forest like ponderosa pine, that's the best indicator of forest health is soil moisture, because that's the limiting resource for the vegetation. And one of the questions that a lot of people have is sort of, is there an optimal way to design a restoration project in terms of how the trees are being thinned, what density, what spatial pattern, to maximize soil moisture and to maximize snowpack, because that is the main source of soil moisture. So we did a field study to investigate some of these mechanisms. And so sort of going back to what we think is going to happen. In terms of getting the increased discharge and groundwater recharge, there's two reasons that might be happening. It could be this increased snowfall, snowpack piece of it, or it could be this decreased evapotranspiration piece of it. So one of the big goals of this piece of the work was to try to tease apart those two effects and say what's really more important, because that's going to be one key to predicting how this works into the future. Snowpack and ET are affected differently by changes in temperature and humidity, so being able to really get sort of a mechanistic and predictive understanding of what's going to happen to these forests depends on separating those two. So this was done at 4 sites near Flagstaff. All of these are on national forest land, and all of them have had restoration projects done in the last 5 to 10 years. At each site, we established 2 to 3 plots. One is a control plot, which is on adjacent forest land that was not restored. And then one or two of the others are a restored plot. At some of these sites, they did one treatment of just thinning and one treatment of thinning and burning. We didn't find any large difference between the two at this time out from restoration. So I'll treat them all together as restored sites. We did soil moisture and snow water equivalent measurements through field surveys. The equipment we're using for soil moisture, it might be a little different than what you're used to. Instead of having probes attached to a data logger, we had probes inserted in the ground that you go out and attach a measuring device to, and they give you an instantaneous reading. So the advantage of those is each set of probes is really cheap. So we were able to do these in large spatial arrays. So we had 45 of these, at 2 of the sites we had 45 probes in restored and 45 in control. At some of the sites we had smaller samples, but we were able to do it over every 5 meters over large transects, so that we could really get at kind of the spatial pattern of what's going on here, because if it's vegetation structure driving these differences, we want to sample these patterns. Also, there's a lot of spatial variability in soil moisture in these sites. And so just getting statistical differences takes a lot of samples. At a couple of sites, we also did have continuously recording soil moisture probes, just to give us the full temporal element. At all of the sites where we had one of these probes, we were also taking snow water equivalent measurements. And we did this as best we could, transport allowing in the winter, but we're generally able to get some data from immediately after large snowstorms and then a week or so after. Things melt pretty quickly in Flagstaff. Normally we'll get a big snowpack, we'll get a foot or two, and then it'll be gone in 2 or 3 weeks.
And what depth you are measuring soil moisture?
So these probes are over the top 30 centimeters of soil, and then we had the continuously recording probes. We had going down to 50 centimeters, which is where you start hitting rocks there. So most of the analysis of rooting depth on ponderosa says they go down to about 50 centimeters. So this was our analysis of snow water equivalent, and we did not find huge differences between the different sites, with the exception of a little bit of change towards or a little bit of difference in persistence of snow, so snow sticking around longer at the restored sites, but overall not much difference, which was surprising. And we actually did find a significant difference in snow depth between the sites. So it was a little weird. A lot of sort of the conventional wisdom is there's more snow in open areas in these sites, but I think what we're finding is if you average those against under canopy, and also account for that in the control sites. A lot of times you're getting snow on the canopy that then sort of falls down and compresses. So you're getting less depth, but the same amount of water. We're actually not finding huge differences in snow. So this is weekly soil moisture measurements over thinned in blue and control sites. Looking at two of our sites. So this top one was restored about 5 years before we did this, and the bottom one was restored about 10 years before we did this. And so this is what, from having a large sample size, we're actually able to look at some of these differences. So when we first got out there after snow off to do our first round of soil moisture measurements, we're already seeing a significantly higher soil moisture in the thinned sites. Right from the start on both of them. And this was consistent across all the sites we did. We always got higher soil moisture measurements right after the snow disappeared in the thin sites, which seems a little odd given that we didn't actually see differences in snowpack. But looking at sort of the pattern of drying, so these are exponential decay curves fit to these, so we can actually see how rapidly they're drying. And we had more rapid drying in the more recently restored site. So this would give a good idea of how much evapotranspiration is occurring. And then less rapid drying not a large difference in drying in the site that had been restored about 10 years ago. So sort of what we believe this is showing is sort of recovery of the vegetation and to take up that additional water that was released by thinning the trees.
These are relative water contents, right? 0 to 100.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
But we still didn't realize what the difference was that was creating this initial difference in volumetric water content between the sites. And from that, we looked at, so these are probes we had measuring continuously. And so blue is control, red is restored. So this gets into some of the spatial variability we have out here. If you go pick one point, you can get control points that have a higher water content than restored points. But sort of just looking at the temporal pattern of these. The dashed lines show when we were actually out there doing the spatially distributed soil moisture sampling. So to zoom in on that initial first loss period, so this would kind of be our like gravity-driven drainage stage of the soil drying process. And so sort of what we think happened here is that we got more of that in the control site than in the restored site, and that's what's accounting for that initial difference we were able to measure, because the snow doesn't account for it, and so we think it has to be this phase. So why would that happen in between two sites that have roughly the same soils? And our thinking and sort of what we would like to explore if we get the chance to do any more of this work is looking at what the effect of coarse root density is on that initial drainage stage, since by reducing tree density, replacing that gets replaced with herbaceous vegetation, which doesn't have those large roots that can create macropore flow. And so that's kind of our working hypothesis of why we saw those initial differences in soil moisture from the other probe data, is that it's this gravity-driven drainage stage.
So it never came to saturation under any condition, is it? I mean, it's always 50% roughly.
Yeah, so it's about, and so one thing is that this was also kind of a low snow year, unfortunately, so we might see different things if we were actually able to get out there after a 3-foot snowstorm had dried. These were about a foot total, which is, doing the math is not enough to saturate the soils here. Okay, and then the last piece of it that we're still kind of working on is the spatial aspect. So one goal of this is looking at the relationship between vegetation structure and soil moisture, and getting back to that kind of those competing effects of, if you have a large gap in the canopy, you're potentially going to open it up to more throughfall and more snowpack, but you're also opening it up to more evaporative drying. And one of the hypotheses kind of in the snow community is that you want to have intermediate levels of canopy closure in these systems to maximize soil moisture. And so what we looked at is based on the gaps we have, so this is change in soil moisture. So the higher the bars are, the more rapidly they dried. So bigger is drier here. And a lot of variability, but looking at points that are in gaps of different canopy widths, so this is under canopy, and then in the smaller canopy gaps, we had less rapid drying, whereas once we got larger, it increased. This last category only had a few points in it, so I don't put a ton of weight on what actually happened there. But it does seem like we're giving some support to this idea that you want to have smaller to intermediate sized canopy gaps. But now sort of what we're exploring is, and so we recently did some aerial surveys of these sites and got high resolution maps of canopies. So in a lot of sort of ecohydrology effects of plants on the soil, we like to think about under canopy and between canopy as sort of our two worlds that we deal with and how those are different. And there's a ton of papers out there looking at how those are different in different sites. So what we'd like to get at by collecting this more detailed canopy structure data is trying to get beyond that and thinking about the zone of influence of a tree, both on the snow around it and on the soil moisture around it. And since that combines both things like shading and interception, as well as the root system, what is the shape of that? Is it directional? What's going on with that? So that's sort of where we're at and where we're analyzing this data. As well as hoping to expand into looking into some of these same types of issues in the southeast, and looking forward to working in some systems where there's more than enough water and we aren't always dealing with scarcity. Okay, so I think I'll leave time for questions here. I want to acknowledge my collaborators, particularly my postdoc advisor, Abe Springer, and Will Flatley was the postdoc who did all the vegetation modeling for the middle part of the talk, who's now at University of Central Arkansas, so also in the southeast now. So I'd be happy to take any questions and can stay around and chat for a while too.
I assume that with the restoration and the reduced evapotranspiration, you're also seeing a reduced productivity and less uptake of CO2. So did you try to estimate or measure that decreased productivity and the impact it might have on climate?
So there actually was another group at NAU that was looking at the carbon aspects of restoration, and you do see the reduced productivity, but if very similar to the hydrology aspect, actually, where for us a lot of the benefit is from preventing wildfires and the effects of wildfires on flood and erosion. By preventing wildfires and the carbon loss associated with wildfires, it's actually better to do the restoration from a carbon standpoint. Okay. So you reduce your productivity some, but you prevent those massive losses. Yes?
I'm not a forester, but I have a question. When you talk about thinning, forest thinning, it's kind of selective logging?
Yeah, when you think about selective logging, where, when we say selective logging, a lot of times that's talking more about trying to get the most economic value. So selecting the trees that will be economically valuable while also being something that can create a gap that things will grow in again. They're almost doing the reverse here, where they're saying, these are the trees we want to leave. This is what we want the structure to look like after we're done. Let's remove everything else. So it is selective logging in a way, but it's almost sort of reversed from the way you would traditionally think about it in forestry, where instead of selecting what you want, you select what you don't want and cut that out.
Do they remove it? What they cut? They remove it from the...
So that's sort of been one of the issues, is what to do with it. So one way to deal with it is to try to put it into piles where it will decompose or can be burned under safe conditions. But there is some effort being put into trying to use it for things like biofuels. It has the problem that it's very decentralized, so getting everything to a plant's a concern. But mainly they want to figure out something to do with it because this is costly. And it's hard to find the money to actually get out and do this. So this was one of the motivations behind this, was if this is beneficial to the people in Phoenix, can we get Phoenix to help pay for forest restoration in Flagstaff? But what to do with it is a sort of a difficult question. Yes.
I guess two questions. One following up from Rona's question. So with the thinning, was it actually a decrease in productivity or carbon sequestration? Because I guess I would anticipate that as you reduce the amount of standing stock of tree, you would have more understory vegetation that would come in that might make up for overall.
Yeah, sort of disturbance
NPV.
recovery. Yeah, there's a couple papers on that that I would have to go back and look at what they actually. So they actually did. Somebody was running an eddy covariance tower in a couple of these sites, so they actually have the carbon exchange data for what happened afterwards. I don't remember what the actual number, if it's up or down.
Yeah, like my expectation was that you would have a reduction of the sequestration, but the productivity overall would either stay more or less the same or actually increase.
Yeah, I don't remember what their findings actually were on that end of it. Yeah, I don't remember which way it actually went. I can see where you're coming from there.
And then like a second question with just kind of working with stakeholders in the area. So as these restoration practices are being undertaken, obviously there's people, the Forest Service and whatnot, but what about dam operators? So is there any concern with these potential enhanced water yields that'll also enhance in-stream erosion, enhance sediment transport, and clog dams, or anything like that? Or
Yeah, so from the dam operator standpoint, they're very big on preventing the high intensity wildfires because actually Phoenix has had, after a couple of the worst wildfires in the Arizona mountains, they had to do like everybody boil your water in Phoenix because the water coming out of the mountains was so bad. So that's a big piece of it. But there also is, you do get people who are concerned about if you're going to go in and do logging, is this going to cause flooding? Because a lot of people have been, Flagstaff had, somebody died in Flagstaff because of one of these post-fire floods recently. And so they're saying, wait, you're gonna go burn the forest? Is this gonna cause it? She did a literature review for a group on this topic, and all the evidence out there is that these things are happening at low enough intensity that it's not going to have an appreciable impact. And so for all of these, from some of these historic watersheds where they did logging, you can look at the change in flood peak across different intensities of thinning, and you don't get a large effect until you're getting up to 60 or 70% basal area removal, and all of the restoration is below that. It is something it's difficult to convince people of, though.
Hey, quick question. Your first part of your talk, it's a complex problem, right? You cut some trees and you're trying to model that.
Mm-hmm.
But the real decision making is either you do a restoration or you don't do the restoration,
Mm-hmm.
right? So what value the complex modeling adds to the actual policy making process? I mean, is there something we learned from it? Because your stream flow increased by 1 to 2%.
Well, so that's there were people saying stream flow is going to increase by 20 to 30%. Based on kind of their back of the envelope calculations.
Which is completely against the back of the envelope.
Yeah.
Intuitive. Why?
Yeah.
So what would be missed by just using common sense back of the engineering calculation as opposed to this complicated regression vegetation model? So
what gets missed is the dynamics of the recovery of. Recovery goes the other way. So you get a peak increase in stream flow after you do the thinning. And then that goes down over some number of years based on kind of what precipitation you're getting in those years. It depends on both the time since thinning and the precipitation in those years. So a lot of those back of the envelopes were, they were not accounting for that decline, and then they were also saying, well, just this percent of precipitation extra is going to make it down, and those end up, it gives you a broad, they could also, based on their assumptions in that, get a zero value. So sort of putting it more reasonably within that 0 to 30% increase range.
How do you know who is right? Either the complex guys are right or the back of the envelope guys are right? How do we know that? Do we have any post-validation?
So they have been doing the thinning and not seeing
Okay.
large things. So I think probably the best idea of what validation do we have is that, we did this through two relatively complicated methods that have come from very different approaches, the process-based and the statistical, and we sort of converged on the same answer. And, I think a lot of what we were able to answer and sort of dig into with the modeling that we did is, of all the assumptions you have to make to get that back of the envelope calculation, which ones are actually right? Which ones are actually okay, you have to assume a certain percent of the forest is, or you have to assume a certain distribution of the climate, which distribution of the climate is right, and then you put that into a model of this.
So the degree of thinning that you used as your model input, that was kind of uniform more or less, or categorical in nature?
So we took that from the Forest Service's plans for the project.
Okay.
And so what we did is for the small section that they'd already planned, we had actually it wasn't exactly what trees were going to go in and cut down, but these are treatment goals. We can translate that to a basal area reduction. And then to do the entire watershed, we assumed that they were going to do things in the same proportions across the entire forest. So we are taking actual Forest Service plans.
But the past, so that's for the predicted stuff, but for the existing or the past stuff, maybe, I don't know if you consider using maybe satellite remote sensing to quantify that in space or something like that.
So to quantify vegetation density?
Yeah, changes in vegetation.
So you're trying to get at through natural variation and vegetation
Well, I mean,
change?
if someone is cutting up a bunch of trees,
Yeah.
that should show up pretty strongly, I would imagine.
Yeah, I'm trying to think if anybody's done remote sensing based estimates of this, but normally it's not too, there's enough red tape on federal lands that there has to be a pretty good record of what you did if you were logging. So I think we've probably never approached it that way because we can always just go call somebody and get the record of how much they cut down versus trying to try to look at it with a satellite.
Another quick question. So is that area affected by the pine beetle kills? Or?
No, so pine beetle is farther north.
Yeah, so
That's in lodgepole pine, which is up in farther northern regions.
I have last question. So when you apply or no apply, when you apply the restoration practice without climate change, their response is different. What I understand from your result is with climate change, it's gonna work. But without no climate change, then it doesn't work. Is that correct? Or?
Well, so basically it's without climate change, we're not going to get a huge reduction in
Right.
runoff. So there's no problem to fix there.
Right.
So with the climate change, we get the reduction in runoff, and we can kind of fix it a little bit by doing some work on the forest. But it's
Can I ask a quick question? So in climate change scenarios that you only looked at precipitation, right? I mean, the hydrologic model that you're using is kind of, I think, like a let's say linear model, CIA type of model that.
yeah.
Yeah.
So it's accounting for precipitation and the inputs, and then it's basically using a space for time substitution to do all the other variables, because we're saying, all right, if ponderosa pine has been replaced by pinyon juniper, we're probably getting more similar climate conditions to what that thrives in.
But not the temperature and evapotranspiration.
No, those weren't modeled directly, although those were accounted for in the vegetation change model.
Oh, sorry to interrupt. Yeah, you can go.
Can I add one more question? So you use hydrological modeling, so it was like linear model?
I was using a statistical model. I tested both linear and quadratic functions
So it
for
was
rainfall
not like
runoff.
physically based model?
No, it's not a physically based model.
Because you use like ensemble of those vegetation models and you call it like this is stochastic, am I right?
So the stochastic component was fire.
Mhm.
With the fire, that was, so the vegetation modeling, that is physically based, and you do have a physical domain there, and essentially, I'm trying to remember how this is actually done by somebody else, so, but you have, when conditions are good for a fire, there's a chance it will happen or not, and so that and then it monitors how that spreads to the landscape. So that's where the stochastic component is coming in, is in each time you run the model, it could come out a little differently based on where those fires go.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.